All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'd like to welcome everybody to our EVs in Georgia Status in the Future panel. This is the kickoff of the 10th Research Expo that it's held annually for Georgia Department of Transportation, bringing all the researchers from the state together. We have an exciting panel today. This is the third time we've done a panel kickoff. The last two were fantastic, so I have really high hopes, and we got a great panel together for this one. For EVs in Georgia, we'll be hearing from Andrew Heath, Mark Smith, Lincoln Wood, and Rich Simmons. Andrew has joined the Georgia Department of Transportation in 2008. He has held numerous positions within the department, including the Office of Planning, Executive Assistant to the Chief Engineer, State Traffic Engineer, and most recently, he serves as a Deputy Chief Engineer over the Divisions of Engineering, Intermodal, and Operations. Mark Smith is an experienced political and government professional. He graduated from Morehouse in 2014 with a BA in sociology. He served on Senator Perdue's staff as the Metro Atlanta Regional Director and on Governor Kemp's administration as a Deputy Director of Governmental Affairs. Afterwards, he has just recently joined the Georgia Department of Transportation as the Senior Policy Coordinator, where he's a project manager over the state's National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan. Rich Simmons is currently the Director of Research and Studies at Georgia Tech's Strategic Energy Institute, where he leads a cross-cutting energy projects with an emphasis on clean electric power, vehicle efficiency, and alternative fuels. And finally, Lincoln Wood. Lincoln is an electrification policy manager at Southern Company based in Atlanta. He drives an EV and has stories to prove why more EV infrastructure is a good thing. And he also, I believe, has sent me maybe the best bio I've ever received. So I really actually like Lincoln's bio. So we're going to start off, and we'll give each of our speakers about 5 minutes where they're going to sort of chat on EVs and the state of EVs in Georgia, the status and the future. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. For the order, we'll start, Andrew, we'll start with you, and then Mark, Lincoln, and Rich. So why don't we go ahead, and Andrew?
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be here. Georgia DOT always appreciates the opportunity to partner with our research institutions across the state, and look forward to this event every year and just continuing our partnerships moving forward. So the idea that if everyone could just quickly mute. Mo, I think you're not muted. But the idea for today, as Mike alluded to, is I'll kick it off just to kind of give a state of EVs in Georgia, what we kind of see happening, some current affairs in the EV space that are playing out here in the state. I'll hand it over to Mark, who's going to get into the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program and the work that he is leading for our Office of Planning on that. And then Lincoln's going to come in from a utilities perspective as we look at just electrification across transportation, and then Dr. Simmons, more of a policy discussion. But certainly encourage everybody at the end to ask questions. I probably want to utilize the chat as much as possible, but folks can unmute and weigh in as well. So, I'll just start by saying, the EV transition is upon us, and it is happening. You only need to look here in Georgia in terms of what's happening from an economic development perspective to see the evidence of that. Over the last few years, we have seen over $13 billion in private investment in the EV space that has come to Georgia. That's obviously headlined by the $5 billion EV manufacturing plant for Rivian just east of Atlanta, the $5.5 billion EV and battery plant for Hyundai just outside of Savannah, and the almost $3 billion investment by SK Battery up in Commerce, just to show, from a headline perspective, the scale of investment that's happening in the EV space. And that's only been in the last couple of years. Those three investments alone account for almost 20,000 jobs in the EV space here in Georgia. So it's pretty clear that this transition is happening, and Georgia has found itself in the epicenter, at least in the Southeast, maybe potentially even the nation, in terms of this transition. Was speaking with Kia Motors a few weeks ago, they will be introducing a new EV model vehicle every year for the next 9 years, just to kind of show their plans. And one only has to look at the last Super Bowl. There were 8 car commercials during the last Super Bowl, and all 8 of those car commercials were for electric vehicles. So it's pretty clear that this transition is upon us, and obviously we at Georgia DOT want to be at the forefront of what's going on. We want to understand what's happening and how this is going to impact the transportation landscape and the transportation sector moving forward. And Mark's going to speak to a lot of the great work that planning is doing exactly to that. So we've also seen not just the private sector investment, we're seeing public sector or public investment as well into the EV space, looking to incentivize this market. A $5 billion investment in the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program through the bipartisan infrastructure law, of which $135 million is coming to Georgia. Mark will get into those details, but those dollars meant to incentivize the construction of the infrastructure needed to charge vehicles across the state. So we're underway with that work. And then the most recently passed Inflation Reduction Act, which included dollars for tax credits for EVs. Obviously, a lot of things to be worked through there about eligibility and things of that nature, but just showing again how the federal government is coming forward as well with dollars to incentivize this market. Now in Georgia, we are obviously very mindful of what is happening here, and that is currently playing out in what's known as the Joint Study of Electrification and Transportation, which is happening now with members of the General Assembly and other state leaders to understand all of the various issues that might come along with the electrification of transportation broadly. So this is not just getting EVs on the roads. This is how do you accommodate the necessary infrastructure? How do you work through transition and adoption? What sort of regulatory issues or regulatory environment might we be stepping into as this transition happens? What is the availability of the grid to accommodate things of that nature? I'm sure Lincoln has some insights into that issue, but trying to understand what this future could hold for us as a state, and how can we prepare ourselves or make necessary adjustments if needed to again see this transition play out. So a lot happening in that space. And just very quickly again, GDOT is increasingly mindful of this transition because of the existing funding mechanisms for transportation and for designing, building, operating, constructing transportation infrastructure. As many of you know, right now we are heavily reliant on motor fuels and motor fuel receipts to collect revenue to build infrastructure. That's an excise tax on gasoline here at the state level, and similar mechanisms exist at the federal level, which builds out the Highway Trust Fund. It doesn't take long to imagine, as you start to see an EV transition happen and electric vehicle adoption happen, that those motor fuel receipts would naturally decline. So we have to be very, very mindful of that transition, what that might mean from a revenue perspective to Georgia DOT and frankly to the state of Georgia, so that we can continue to maintain and operate and build out our infrastructure that's needed for the citizens of Georgia. Now, we do have an electric vehicle index fee in place, and that fee is indexed so that the EVs are not necessarily riding for free today. But there's a lot of work to be done to understand what does that mean as EVs begin to proliferate and grow in number, would that revenue keep up with what we might like to see or hope to see, so that we can maintain our infrastructure. So a lot of work to be done in the future to understand how we can get there as this transition plays out. But the bottom line is it is playing out. And one only has to look at that $13 billion investment over the last couple of years to just show the proof in the pudding that the private sector is stepping to the table. We're seeing investment on the public side, so it is clear that this transition is going to play out in the both the near and long term. So I'll conclude there with my opening remarks, and I'll just pass it over to Mark to talk through the NEVI plan.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I like to start these presentations with noting that Some of this work was led up by our governor in August 2021, who launched the Electric Mobility and Innovation Alliance, which which is housed and led out of economic development, which has brought a lot of those opportunities here to the state that Andrew mentioned earlier with what we have seen in this EV space from manufacturers. And then by November 2021, the administration signed into law the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, which has the NEVI program, National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, which was created to serve two purposes. One, to create a nationwide network of 500,000 EV chargers by the year 2030, and two, to ensure a convenient, reliable, and equitable charging experience for all users. So the goal of US DOT and US DOE is to accelerate this equitable adoption of EVs, including those who cannot reliably charge at home, and to position the U.S. industries to lead global transportation electrification efforts. And so how does the administration plan to do that? With the partnership of the states? As Andrew mentioned, there were $5 billion that's to be allocated over fiscal years 2022 through 2026. 135 million was apportioned to the state of Georgia, and that's with the maximum of 80% federal share. And so this NEVI plan has required GDOT to submit a plan, which we submitted on August 1st. We are currently waiting for approval, which should be delivered to us by September 30th. There are key elements that this plan requires, and some of those elements are, station uptimes, 24/7 accessibility by the general public, cybersecurity. A big one has been stakeholder engagement, as this is a very new space for DOTs. We like to remind people, 100 years ago, DOTs didn't, stand up gas stations. So this is very new, and the stakeholder engagement is important as we pull in from the private sector to other state agencies, to utility companies, as well as equity groups, to help us determine how to disperse these equity benefits and remain compliant with Justice 40. And then also workforce development. And so I'll talk about some of the work that we have done to date, which most of that has been stakeholder engagement. We like to say that the plan that we submitted on August 1st is a plan to plan. It is not the final plan, but kind of the plan to lay the groundwork to unlock the funds. And this plan will unlock the funds for fiscal year 2022 and 2023. That does not mean the money will go out of the door, by October of 2022 or even the beginning of 2023. What we are working on now is sort of putting the implementation and deployment pieces together as we work out the contracting mechanism, what it will look like when we partner with the private sector, and I'll touch on that later. But one of the big pieces that I'd like to hit on is a lot of the stakeholder engagement and what we have learned. And so we have met with our regional planning partners, local government entities. We have met with over 13 of the private businesses, which represent potential vendor and site hosts. And meeting with them was to inform the private sector of GDOT's customer-driven approach here, the laws and structures that are unique to Georgia, and what some of the best procurement practices that vendor and site hosts recommend for the deployment of this charging infrastructure. We have met again with our utility partners, and meeting with them is to assess our grid power availability and site upgrade costs that are needed for EV supply equipment, strategies to approach ownership and make ready, and then also having the discussion around rates, tariffs, and grid and load management for EV supply equipment. For the plan that we submitted, we have 5 goals, but first and foremost, what we like to clarify is that GDOT aims to be a niche investor here. It is not our goal to own, operate, or maintain the charging equipment. Our plan seeks to try and drive the private sector to go where they would not go naturally. So to really drive that economic development in areas of the state that the private sector will not go on their own, specifically rural Georgia. And so our plan has a goal in 5 areas, and that is to, 1, be compliant with federal requirements, to be customer-driven deployment. We want to go where the EV drivers prefer to charge, regardless of whether the private sector investment can fully fund that. So where are they? Where will they be going? Where do they prefer to charge? We're looking at hopefully that these sites will be placed in locations that will optimize economic development opportunities from EVs. And again, as I mentioned before, another goal is the private sector ownership and operation. That it does include nonprofits as well. And then also the sustainability and reliability of the operations for this infrastructure over 5 years. You know, we don't want to put these in locations where they will never be used. So we want to carefully think about where these are placed, again, as it relates to the EV customers. Some of the requirements, and I think I may have seen a question pop up as, you know, GDOT considering, you know, other charging levels outside of DC fast charging. And right now, you know, the requirements are DC fast chargers. And first and foremost, we must fully build out our alternative fuel corridors. What does that mean? That is a minimum of 4 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers at each corridor. So these are, in this corridor is 50, you know, a minimum 50 miles apart, and 1 mile from the exit. Right now, Georgia has about 11 NEVI compliant stations, and we have a gap of 35. And so that is our first goal of the first year of this funding. The secretary hasn't, you know, announced when guidance was released that he wouldn't fully certify a state is fully built out in the first year. And so that is our goal there. We are hoping that as guidance continues to evolve here, and you know, we get more rules, final rulemaking guidance from the federal government and Joint Program Office, that this could include level 2 charging, as we know that is probably the most effective, you know, charging that is available out there for people. But that right now is not funded or a part of the guidance or the requirements, but that is something that we hope to see out of the evolving guidance there. And I think I'll stop there, have more questions, but just wanted to give an overview of the plan, what we have submitted, which is, you know, mostly all of the work that we have done with our utility partners and our stakeholders to kind of get a lay of the ground. And we are now moving into what is called our implementation plan phase. So I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. So Lincolnwood Electrification Policy Manager at Southern Company, I have to say, as an EV driver, I'm so excited that we even get to be here today and have this conversation. I can't say that I've never done this on the side of the road and have to be towed. I've never been that low on the battery, but there have been cases where I rolled into my driveway with 3 and 4% on the battery because there was nowhere to charge. So, you know, life is never dull, and my poor family has to go with me and experience all this all together. So that could either be we're on the bleeding edge or we just are suckers for punishment. So I'll let you decide on that one. But let's talk for a moment about electric transportation in general. I know we're talking today, a lot of the conversation has been around really passenger vehicles, the cars you and I might drive every day. And those are important, especially to us because we have places to go, right? But electric transportation is so much more than that. And Southern, as a utility, as an enterprise, has a long history in electric transportation. We didn't just jump into the space last year. In the last 5 years, we've been here since probably the 1980s with ET prototypes and maybe even further back. We've done a lot of what I would call off-road electric transportation. So you think about airports or seaports. So if you've flown out of Terminal F, for example, in Hartsfield-Jackson, though all of that ground equipment is electric, or if you happen to visit the ports in Savannah, the shore cranes, those are also electric, plugged straight into the grid. So when we talk about electric transportation, it encompasses a wide swath of equipment and use cases from really Class 1 all the way up to Class 8. But if you think about what Southern is working on, the easiest way to think about it, at least how I break it down, there's kind of three A approaches. So the first A is advanced EV charging infrastructure. The second A is accelerate fleet electrification. And the third is advocate for adoption of EV technology. So let's break all that down a little bit. So we've talked a lot about EV infrastructure, and we have Georgia DOT on the phone to kind of explain about the NEVI program. But Georgia Power was already installing EV charging infrastructure before that, as far back as really 2014. With community charging islands around the state to enable kind of a minimum level of EV charging. So yes, you can get there from here. It might not be a lot, but you're not stranded, right? And that's, kind of the first generation of DC fast charging. But in recent years, Georgia Power has rolled out a make-ready program. So that's all of the infrastructure from the meter up to the pad the charger sits on, but not the charger itself. And so I see the question, Rich. I'll hit that one in a second around the electric grid. But so there's, the make-ready piece of infrastructure, and so that piece is rolling out. And so now we get to combine it, right, with money coming from the federal government and the NEVI program to make EV charging even more available. But since Rich asked the question about the electric grid, let's stop there for a moment before I go on to my other two. We talk a lot about electrification, and when we start bringing the subject up, I start getting questions around, can the grid handle it? I've even heard the words grid failure thrown out there because people are like, oh my God, the sky is falling, we've got to charge all these EVs. The first thing I say is let's all take a step back and take a breath, because when we think about fueling your gas vehicle, we don't all run out and go get gas at one time, because what happens if we do? Gas stations run dry. And we see that in hurricane evacuations all the time. The gas stations along those evacuation routes run out. So I often get the question framed as, if you take every car on the connector and try to make those an EV, like, well, the grid can't handle it. Well, if you did the same thing with gas cars, the gas stations around the connector would probably run out, right? Same sort of thing. So what does that actually mean? So when you think about charging an EV, utilities already have tools in their tool belts, like time of use rates, that are going to incent those vehicles to be charged overnight. So for example, Georgia Power has a time of use rate where it's 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It's 1 cent per kilowatt hour. So that's when our generating plants are typically less stressed. So you're already charging at an off-peak time. But even more than that, 80% of charging happens at home and at work. So when you think about DC fast charging, it's not a use case where you have to go to a DC fast charger to charge your vehicle, unless you live in a multifamily complex, right? So you don't have charging in your garage, or you park on the street, or you have some other limitation in your garage at home where you can't charge at home. Like, maybe you have an old home and your panel can't handle it, or whatever that looks like. So there are some use cases there that we still have to work through, and I'll happily acknowledge that. But just in terms of driving your electric vehicle, you don't typically charge it the full all the time. That's also bad for the battery, and then car manufacturers tell you that. So you try to keep it 80% or under, unless there's a reason you need to charge it to 100%. So the behavior there is different. We haven't seen necessarily any issues to this point, not to say we won't, but around the grid itself in terms of supplying energy. One thing utilities do, and we do well, is plan, especially short-term, medium-term, long-term, around what generation needs will be 20, 30 years out. And so we have EV load in our forecast. That's not to say, however, there may not be limited impacts, and we still have to figure out what that looks like, right? And I'll give you an example. Would be, you see vehicles that are rolling out with higher and higher charge rates at home. So we would say level 2 charging would be maybe 7 kW, which is typically how you're going to charge your vehicle unless there's a reason you got to DC fast charge. But if that jumps to 10 or 11 kW, or in some vehicles rolled out are 19.2 kW, and you add that on to maybe the peak of the home, which is already 12 or 13 kW, then we might be approaching a 30 kW peak demand for a typical home if it has an EV there. we don't know exactly what that looks like yet. So that might be, you know, is that a transformer we need to swap out? That's part of the, I guess, the drum that I always beat when I have this conversation is if you're electrifying, tell your utility, tell them early, tell them before you install any equipment, go ahead and let them know this is what I'm thinking about doing, so we can start having those conversations early. That's probably the biggest, I guess, defense we have in terms of figuring out where, you know, we may have impacts or not. But as a rule, you know, we haven't seen any of that in our service territory to date. But I'll say that that component comes into play, especially around fleet electrification. So like think about a package delivery company and you have a warehouse with a little bit of AC and lights, and all of a sudden you have 50 or 100 trucks that have to all charge overnight, and the grid around that maybe wasn't really built for that load. That's especially important that you tell the utility early, this is the transition that's about to happen. And the reason you want to think about it, you only touch the concrete one time. You dig up the concrete, you install the conduit, you put it back. That's the only time you ever do it. So if your utility knows about that ahead of time, we can advise and try to work that out as opposed to making changes on the back end if for some reason those become necessary. The fleet electrification really, from my standpoint, probably has a bigger grid impact in a kind of a localized spot because it's a bunch of vehicles in one place that have to charge. And that's why Southern has really put forth a couple things. One is Volta. It's our Volta tool called Predict EV. That's working, it's almost like a questionnaire working with fleet managers to figure out what vehicles would fit your use case, for example, and whether carbon offsets, what charging infrastructure do you need? Can you finance that and put that on your electric bill? I mean, that's kind of the initial set with that. And we offer through Spark Fund, another one of our partners would be charging equipment installation. So it can be as turnkey as you need it to be, but that's why we have that focus in that area. A couple other things you might want to know about, and then I'll stop talking, would be first would be around advocating for EV adoption. So, you know, we talked about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So a lot of times Southern will get questions from some of our, you know, legislators in the federal or state space around, you know, what might be helpful, how does this market expand? So, you know, we're happy to lend our technical expertise and suggestions when that happens. But Southern's also a founding member of at least 3 electric transportation trade associations around the country. And you think about it in a Big Ten approach, so bringing together not just utilities, but auto manufacturers, charging companies, engineering firms to really think, you know, how do we move this industry together, you know, as a whole? So not just maybe for our benefit, for everyone's benefit. And I guess the last comment I'll make, if you look over my shoulder, that I think is chemistry, but it's not battery chemistry, and I'm not that smart. So full disclosure, I am off-site today. I'm on the campus of UGA here in Athens. One of the things Southern has done over the past year is work with UGA to stand up an e-mobility certificate. So to Andrew's point, when we talked about investment at the beginning of the call, investment in the state, that's another key word for workforce. We need a whole lot of workers to figure out how to work in this space, and where are they going to come from? And the example I like to think about is electrification takes so many different forms, and how do we create graduates from our technical schools and universities that hit the ground running and understand the space? And here's an example. If you work for, let's say, a large package delivery company and you electrify your fleet, you might need to understand electrification and how you charge and how electricity is priced and what battery capacity looks like, what happens to the batteries when it's cold outside. But you might also need to understand supply chain and logistics, because you still have to run a warehouse. Supply chain and logistics is not it's not in engineering. That's typically, at least at UGA, it's in the business school. So that e-mobility certificate that the school is standing up is like an endorsement on top of your major. It's not a whole other major, but it is kind of a stamp on your diploma saying this person is knowledgeable in this space. And enrollment for that starts in spring 2023. So, you know, in town today to have a little more conversation around that, but excited to see, one, you know, where that goes, and two, also how we, you know, can work with other colleges and universities around the state, because it's not just a UGA thing, it's a statewide issue that we're trying to solve, you know, a lot of workers. So I'll stop there for the moment. I'll see some other questions coming in, but I know Rich still has a lot to say himself. So Rich, you want to jump in and then we'll go to questions?
Absolutely. Thank you. Good segue. Yes, UGA is not the only university in the state. I'm over here at Georgia Tech, and there are a lot of other great institutions that we're going to really rely on in this. I will get to a couple points. I'm really excited to be on the panel, thanks to my colleagues on the panel. I wanted to start with a quick anecdote. So I'm actually a mechanical engineer and did most of my industry experience, 15 years or so in automotive design, R&D, and deployment. So quickly got to Dearborn in 1995 and was asked to work on a thermal management problem on the Mustang Cobra 5-liter 32-valve sports car, which was the Tesla of 1995 in some sense. And my very next project was a new sort of skunkworks opportunity called the Ford Ranger Electric, which rolled out in 1998, which maybe you could think of as the Rivian of 1998. And so let me just say those were pretty surreal experiences, thinking about this old world muscle car era, really at the dawn, maybe the second or third dawn of the EV. I think we're at the final and maybe hopefully meaningful and surreal revolution of EVs now. Let me just give you a little update on the Ford Ranger in '98. It was expensive as heck. I don't even know that the customer paid the full amount. Lots of unwritten money on those. It was slow and heavy. It had a very limited range. I think 40 miles with the lead acid, maybe 60 or 70 with the nickel metal hydride. There was really nowhere to charge it, at least nowhere where you couldn't, come back and get it within 24 hours and have it be topped off. And the grid was comparatively pretty dirty, admittedly, we know in the 90s. And so let's fast forward and looking at this as a snapshot. It's so exciting to have been part of this the last couple decades, but now even thinking, what was the challenge there? It was some of these performance issues, but also that system charging infrastructure grid sort of interface. With a gasoline vehicle, we weren't worried about, we had that, right? It was already on every street corner. And so I think we're in a great place where we have dealt with the cost mostly. We have dealt with the performance. They're still heavy, but they're fast. The grid is really getting greener, and the benefit of an EV is it's going to continue to pay back some of those benefits in the future. But our work here at Tech is really focused on quantifying some of the benefits and costs and challenges, so that, as Mark mentioned, people can make more educated decisions. I think Lincoln mentioned a lot of the press is around passenger cars, but obviously we know there are some other really meaningful use cases where we can see serious movement of the needle in the very near term. I'm thinking, Andrew mentioned some of the large announcements. We also have Bluebird here. We have the supply chain. We know recycling and end of life is important. We have opportunities and partnerships with MARTA and some of the other transit agencies. So what we're trying to do is really understand where these use cases are maybe making the most sense now, what the private sector is already planning to do to sort of make sure that, and I think that you see this, right, with some of the couriers. We also think about mostly moving ourselves, but a good percentage of the movement in vehicles is goods, right? And service provision and so forth. So some of the medium duty, return to base, they're not used overnight. And this gets to the question that actually I did not ask Lincoln. It was Brennan Roney online asking about grid capability. It was a great question. I also want a chance to tackle it, and then we'll turn it back to Mike for questions. Yeah, the grid is basically following demand all the time. And so for me, it's a matter of how do you manage the charging in a way that we could utilize the resources we have more effectively. When you think about fast charging, you're actually asking for a really large withdrawal from the bank in a very short time at a very specific location. If we can think about that as a little bit more slow, planned event, or a more organized system as we scale, that's a good way to think about making sure the grid can keep up with this growth. as Lincoln pointed out, in terms of consumption, we're talking about an order of magnitude equivalent to the current grid if we get to some of these numbers that we're talking about for 2035, 40. And so, you know, yes, for sure, in the near term, single digits, we're going to be able to utilize excess capacity. Presumably that will come in the low off-peak areas, but that's largely still natural gas. And so we all are doing a lot here at Tech to figure out the CO2 implications. And I've done a lot in terms of, so it's about the time and the space that where you're charging that determines what's being generated by the power plant that really effectively is your CO2 footprint. So, you know, even though you have an EV, your footprints, even in a city like Atlanta, could be in a very wide range depending on when you're choosing to charge it. And then you can layer on the national perspective. We know there's certain regions that are rich in clean and low carbon fuels where it's more favorable and less critical when you might charge, and others where it's very fossil rich. The final point I'll make on education, I think we're going to need a lot more of this. I'm pleased that the team is collaborating with the DOTs. I was pleased to meet with Mark and his team and Janine and the planning team as a part of the EMEA process, and also going forward in the next phase of the NEVI. We're also educating students, like Lincoln pointed out. We're going to need jobs that don't exist today. We're going to need to create curriculum that are on very new topics, very dynamic. We're going to need to think about some of these hard trade-offs. But I think in general, these partnering arrangements are going to be part of the reason that we feel good about it. And the final note is we've stood up a Southeast Alliance that involves a lot of different categories of stakeholders. I think there was already good activity, but we're convening, you know, we said automakers rarely sat at the public commission, and, you know, that was an important connection to make. And now we're trying to build out some of those connections. I'm just really pleased to be part of this, and thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel.
All right. First, let me start by thanking the panel members. That was fantastic. There's a lot to unpack in everything that was just said. Plus, you're all now honorary academics because I gave you 5 minutes. You took 10. So way to go. I appreciate that. I'm going to ask the audience, go ahead and enter questions in the chat. So we're not talking over each other, but so please, if you have some questions of panelists, go ahead and put it there. Let me get started with one. I think this is sort of a condense of a little bit of some of what's already there. And that is when we think about the state of Georgia and the status and the future of EV. Are there regional differences or differences across the state that we need to be thinking about in terms of maybe the grid or rural versus suburban versus urban on how this is going to occur, and maybe are the issues different in different parts of the state in terms of having a successful EV deployment?
Well, I'll jump in real quick, and I'm going to tee up Mark, and Lincoln will probably want to weigh in from the grid perspective, but I know Mark will want to weigh in on the NEVI perspective, and from GDOT's point of view, that's sort of our primary interface, I would say, in terms of those geographic differences, is the location of these EV chargers, where they currently are, where they're expected to be. You know, it doesn't take long to look at a map to see where EV charging stations currently are, and obviously it's primarily around Metro Atlanta. So when you talk about ubiquitously providing this infrastructure, we've got to think through, how do you get the infrastructure to some of these more rural areas, these longer haul corridors? How do you incentivize that to happen? Because clearly the private business case may not be there to make that investment and think about the potential to recoup costs. And part of the NEVI plan, and I'll toss it to Mark here, dictates that, right? It dictates a specific build out across the state before we can unlock the rest of the state, so to speak. So Mark, I'll hand it to you on that.
Mark, yeah. As you address this, could you give 30 seconds on what NEVI actually is? There's probably a number of people on this panel who, we keep saying the NEVI plan. I don't think they know what NEVI is.
So it's National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program or Plan. So that's what NEVI is. And then, you know, I think Andrew touched, of course, where there isn't a business case, how we're trying to lay that out for the private sector to go where they normally won't go. But once we decide it's there, what we're working on right now with one of our consultant teams, JLL, and so they're big in real estate, is how do we grade what potential site locations will be there in the rural areas? Again, we have some requirements that have to be met, and one of those are security and amenities. And so, we don't want to put this in, I hate using this word because everywhere is somewhere, but in the middle of nowhere, right? And we want to make sure where this is placed, and that challenge will be in rural areas, is that there will be amenities 24/7. What those amenities look like, of course, could be, a restroom, maybe a place where they can get food, something that looks like your fueling stations today, likely. But also a big component of that is security and safety for those that are charging their equipment, as they may have to sit there for 20, 30 minutes. And so I think that's opening up a door of unique challenges and opportunities of exactly where will these be placed along rural corridors.
And just to clarify, Mike, to your original question, the NEVI program is specifically designed to install EV charging infrastructure, specifically DC FC charging for 150 kilowatt ports is what that program is requiring. And it looks like Kelly Gwynn put the plan in the chat, so if anybody's interested to see our exact plan, just take a look at that document to see how we're addressing the requirements of the program.
I think the other piece of this, having lived this of traveling to different parts of Georgia with an EV and either having to drive south to charge to be able to go back north because there's no charging around, or as I found during the pandemic, if you drive an EV, you look at your route path and you can plot it out and you're good. Let's say on the middle of the drive, you want to take a detour, or you take a little longer at one area or something that you didn't necessarily plan on, is when you find yourself getting into trouble. So having charging stations that aren't just in the Metro Atlanta area is vitally important for the technology to work just overall. As part of the NEVI program, there's a heavy equity component as well, Justice 40, that is all written throughout the program, which I think is really important for our rural and underserved communities throughout the state. And the other piece of that to me is then working with the city and county governments in those areas to help them understand what this transition actually means for them. And it could take a number of different paths, right? It could be, a municipal fleet, and if there's a transition there that needs to be made, but it could also be in terms of economic development. Where is that city or county trying to go? Are they trying to attract an EV, maybe supply chain manufacturer, because that's definitely in play given all the investment in Georgia to date? Or is it just they want some charging in their downtown area to encourage tourism? And understanding what that blueprint looks like. Georgia Power does have some conversations ongoing right now with Fulton County and different communities here, just to have, to start that conversation with the idea that if we can pull a blueprint together, that can be a template we'll share across the state as well. So there's lots of angles to figure out how this transition happens for sure.
And then just a final point on this location question, from a product development standpoint, we used to have this mantra that every vehicle design had to be capable of everything. And I think we saw that standard features accommodated the mass statistical distribution. I think there's an opportunity to revisit that. A lot of families know, an EV has certain high value add options, and then there's some things it can't do. I think that's true all the way through these use cases. And I think it's just more important than it has been, to think of this as really matching and being more careful about planning the use case against the vehicle product. And so, you look at this relative to rural applications, the F-150 Lightning is a pickup truck that hopefully will, do as well as the legacy gas version. And it will have new features like being able to provide backup and vehicle to grid. But, some of those traditional job site needs are going to rely on gasoline still. So it's just a point that we got to be careful. And I think these conversations help instill that.
There's been a couple of questions asking about can solar be part of the solution to the grid? And I think they're looking for, is there a limit how much solar somebody can generate from their house? And if they're plugging in at night, can they be sort of banking the solar during the day? Is essentially a distributed solar network potentially going to be part of the grid solution, or how might that play out?
So I guess from a macro level, one thing we see in the space is many companies, for example, have sustainability goals that they're trying to hit. And electrifying their fleet are an easy way for them to kind of get there and cut their carbon emissions. And usually after this come in two paths, right? It's electrification of the fleet on one hand, and then on the other hand is they want you want that fleet charged with all renewable energy, so some sort of purchase power agreement. And that's, way more common than you might think. So I would say, thinking about it less from a solar on your house and charging your car as a more like utility scale solar, and how does that fit in with operating the grid in, I guess, at a macro level as opposed to individual levels. So renewables will be part of that solution, but it doesn't have to be solar. It could be wind or, however those renewables get integrated into the energy supply.
And the other point on this really is Lincoln implies, it's the grid mix that's going to determine. We actually benefit from having solar at all locations. It's more expensive in some than others, but we also know really what matters is what's on the margin when we add this incremental load. And that's a very complicated traditional process that's getting updated. We know that all the solar that's going to be generated, hopefully in Georgia at least, will get consumed. Some of it will go to vehicles, but that means as we retire coal, that's the bigger question. What are we replacing it with so that we can, charge the vehicles? And a quick final note, we're putting in a capability here at my lab with solar canopies to go direct to the vehicle. I think the consumers want to know exactly these questions, and that's where this education becomes important. Can I guarantee a clean charge? If not, how can I guarantee the cleanest charge?
So building on that, as I look at the chat thread, I think there's a number of questions on the environmental impacts. So, for instance, one specific is, so EPA is currently considering a lowering of the national ambient air quality standards for ozone and fine particulate matter. EVs, especially electric trucks, may be important to meeting these standards. Is this currently being factored into the planning process and the incentives? And there's some other questions similar. Are the mining issues in terms of what it takes to create the batteries? Are these things being factored into the plans that are being made? Anybody?
Yeah, I think I'll say, what the EPA is currently considering has not been factored into our planning yet. One of the things that I will go back into is that the plan that we submitted on August 1st is the plan to plan. So that, opens room for, again, what will be evolving guidance, new rules and requirements that will come from the federal government. So that is something that I am sure that we will, track as we continue to deploy. And also to add another caveat there, that the plan will be updated every year to meet some of these adjustments. But as far as specifically with the NEVI plan, I think we say that we are always tracking new developments from the federal government, but that is not a part of the initial planning process.
And I think the research is important here too, because in order to make good decisions, we need to have good data. So we're looking at CO2, of course, but also the relocation of tailpipe emissions to potentially fossil fuel plants or the elimination with renewables. That has equity implications too. So I think it's important we look at air quality impacts, health impacts, the substitution effect. And obviously, to plan and integrate the plan, we just need a better set of data to inform those decisions.
There's a number of questions, and I think you've somewhat addressed them. Was somebody going to say something else?
I was just going to say, Mike, I am not an expert in this by any stretch of the imagination, but getting back to the raw materials question, I mean, that's a very important point, is that battery manufacturing requires those raw materials to stand up that manufacturing. And it's not just the manufacturing piece, it's also the recycling piece that needs to come to fruition. You've seen a lot of statistics about the ability to recycle and that they are heavily recyclable, but that needs to be stood up as well to work through that materials question.
There are a couple pieces. I dropped one in the chat, a link to the Union of Concerned Scientists fact sheet. It's a little bit dated now, in May of 2020, but even at that point, it was saying, EVs are generally cleaner than gasoline vehicles. And that was, using data that's a couple years old, right? So the idea that the grid is continually getting cleaner, more and more renewables being integrated, that's some encouraging news. But I'll also say there's an article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe it's March of 2021. They did a life cycle analysis from, I guess, construction all the way to disposition of like a Toyota RAV4 and a Tesla Model 3. And it was side by side, mapped out emissions from each vehicle and kind of, generation mix all the way through, like how did they compare? And really up until 20,000 miles, the EV had higher emissions than its gasoline counterpart. But by the time you hit the 20,000 mile mark, then they're neck and neck, and the EV takes over. And by the time you totally finish the vehicle, by the time that vehicle is life cycled out, its emissions are way, way, way lower compared, and typically operating costs are also lower. So there's lots of benefits there. It's just kind of that initial piece of manufacturing with the battery minerals and everything else. And those are issues there that the Inflation Reduction Act is also seeking to, I don't know, solve. Less reliance on foreign entities might be the best way to say that. So there might be some pain there in the short term of automakers sourcing, I guess, materials for their vehicles, and some vehicles that may or may not qualify for the EV tax credits based on how that legislation reads. It has lots of twists and turns in it, though, so I won't speak to exactly what each of them says, but I would suggest maybe researching that too to see who and what will qualify and kind of where the government's trying to go in addition to some of the EPA questions.
I would agree with everything Lincoln said, and I'd make one addition back to a point Andrew made. What I tell my students is if the total footprint is 100%, about 10% of that is in the mining and the extraction for an ICE engine vehicle, and about 40% is in that same phase and so forth for an EV. But the overall 100% is about half for the EV. The big unknown and wild card, which we're dealing with, is the end of life. We really don't have data yet. We're still dealing with this with solar and batteries. So that is something that's very active on our research horizon.
So there's actually a number of questions in the thread, and I think we've somewhat addressed them, but there is definitely a high interest in the group on the idea of using solar, using wind. Can it be local customers as opposed to industrial solar? I know the way you had just talked about, Lincoln. And we don't need to get into that more, but I think it is interesting to see how strong that thread is through what people are asking. The other thread that I think is showing up is asking for a little bit more about the role of public versus private and how that might play out. I know, Mark, you had mentioned, I mean, GDOT's really not trying to get into the business of running chargers. So at some point, somebody's got to run these. And so how do you see it in terms of infrastructure spending? Where are those dollars? How do we get this balance in terms of maintenance? How is that public-private piece going to work out? Or should it maybe work out?
Yeah, look, I think what we want to do is make sure we use this $135 million. And again, that's a max share of 80%, federal 20%, depending on where they are, may come out different buckets. So we want to encourage that it is a private partner that we contract with that can meet that 20%. Maybe they can't in certain areas of the state. And again, utilities can play a part in this too. But I mean, that is a realistic challenge of, what happens after the 5 years. That is a big question. That's why we want to make sure that we allow them as much flexibility in this process to choose the right site locations, working with the right vendors, with the hopeful that they could commit to owning and operating this after funding. Maybe there will be additional funding that comes down the road. I think a lot of that is still up in the air, but I think that is definitely going to be a challenge of who picks this up after the 5 years. And it's one that if we allow flexibility with the private sector and how they want to operate and maintain that, that could work. There are different models that we are looking at. One being, do we want someone who wants to have the risk of they just host and someone else manages it? Do you want someone who does we host and we manage and operate it? And so as we look at some of those models, I think that will help us in the long run. And some of these will be different. I think on some corridors, there may be a host, someone that decides it's a fueling station says, we'll host it, but someone else comes in and manages it, and they contract with someone at the end of those every 5 years. There may be some corridors where someone says, oh, we will own and operate this. And if it's there, again, encouraging them to, hopefully see the benefit in the case to continuing that ownership. I hope that answers.
Yeah.
If I could add, our NEVI plan does, on that question of public versus private, our NEVI plan does a nice job in sort of characterizing what we see our role in this, and that is of a niche investor. Essentially, we are providing dollars to incentivize the expansion of EV charging infrastructure. We will not be in a position where we are operating and maintaining EV charging stations. We don't see that as the role of Georgia DOT. And for all the other DOTs that I've spoken with, and I'm sure Mark's probably spoken with all of them, I don't think any others are going to be in that role either.
Sure.
So that leaves us in a position, a very unique position that we've never really been in of, state DOTs have $5 billion to get out the door for EV charging. And we want to do so where we're incentivizing that this deployment, but not to be in a position at the end of the day where we are owning, operating, or maintaining EV chargers around the country, because we don't see that as our role. So we're trying to thread that needle, so to speak, like you said, examining a number of legal structures, procurement structures that best kind of guardrail our role, I would say, so that we can be successful here. So it is a very unique position, and it will be a unique relationship at the end of the day.
So let me ask one last question, because I know we're about out of time. I very much appreciate the panel's time. This has been fantastic. In our audience, we have a lot of university academic researchers who are very interested in the future and making this happen. So the question is, what do you all need to make this happen? What research would be most impactful? What tools do you need? What would help? What could this group do to help this happen? What do you need?
Well, I'll just start with one thing, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, and that is sort of how DOTs have traditionally been structured as it relates to funding. I introduced that question early on about as you transition from ICE engines to EVs, what does that mean from a funding structure, both at the state and federal level? So understanding, everyone getting their crystal balls out to understand what the future is going to hold. I know that's a very simple thing, but that's going to play out in real time for DOTs as we continue to try to do our jobs of maintaining, operating, and building infrastructure. This has a direct impact on that. And so helping to understand what that is going to look like, how that's going to play out, is going to be critical for us to be successful moving forward.
And my answer is really about convergence. I think we're talking to people we never thought we would, and these types of events will continue and really promote good dialogue, exchange of info. I think, this analogy that we have a certain capacity of highway and road work, is a good one, because those roads are not necessarily always in high demand, but sometimes they're over subscribed, and the same is going to be true for the grid. So that's why these interactions between all these different stakeholders are going to help us manage it efficiently. And then, of course, the students and the researchers starting to listen to, you know, other communities of research and trying to connect dots.
Go ahead, Lincoln. Absolutely.
So I'll second everything Rich just said, and I'll also add, at least from a personal standpoint, I think a lot about the battery technology itself, that lithium ion likes to be a little bit flammable. And there are some, you know, there are some critical mineral issues that we have to solve. I know the industry is trying to navigate towards solid state batteries that are much more stable and reduce the, you know, amount of rare earth minerals in those batteries. As an industry, as we scale up, I can't help but think, you know, we have to get there quicker than maybe we think we are. I mean, I think the more progress we can make to get there and have a more reliable product, I think will only help in the future. So that's my own personal piece of it.
Mark?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that would be helpful for the deployment, particularly around the Justice 40 requirements, you know, I think when people hear that, they think 40% of the chargers have to be dropped there. And I think, Rich, you may have a tool or resources for this, but one of the things that would be helpful is, you know, how would the benefits of a charger that is placed support the air quality around the surrounding area, workforce development, etc. So not just the charger itself, but a little bit more data to see on what does the charger mean for the immediate surrounding area, whether that's noise quality, air quality, etc.
All right. Well, we are out of time, and I thank everybody for speaking today. This has been fantastic. Andrew, Mark, Rich, Lincoln, this would greatly appreciate this. We are creating a recording of this. We will post this online if anybody wants to go back. I'm sure if somebody would like to reach out to one of the panelists, feel free to send an email to GTI. We'll get you in contact with whoever you want. So thank you again so much. We really appreciate everybody's time. Tomorrow is the in-person poster session. I'm looking forward to seeing folks at the in-person Research Expo as well. And we'll see y'all later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.